There's a very specific kind of person who is great at being loved when things are hard. When they're useful, when they're needed, when they're solving something, fixing something, showing up for someone at 2 in the morning, in those moments, love makes sense to them. It feels warm, it feels right. But then someone just loves them. Quietly, without asking for anything back, and something in that person shuts down, gets uncomfortable, starts looking for the catch. If that sounds familiar, this video is for you. Most people assume that not being able to receive love is a confidence problem. Like if you just believe in yourself more, you let people in. That's not what's happening. What's underneath it is older and stranger than low self-esteem. It goes back to how love worked in the place where you first learned what love was. And for a lot of people watching this, love in that place wasn't something that arrived. It was something you produced. You perform for it. You earn it. You manage yourself carefully enough to keep it from going away. And the thing about learning love that way, it doesn't just shape how you give it. It shapes whether you think you are allowed to just receive it, without doing anything, without a reason. Carl Jung had a concept he called the false self. Not the person you actually are, the person you figure out you needed to be to stay safe, to keep the warmth coming, to avoid the very specific pain that happens when love gets withdrawn. What he was describing is what happens when a child's real needs get pushed into the shadow, because showing them wasn't safe, or wasn't welcome, or just didn't work, so they went down. And what came out in their place was a version of the person built around being useful, being good, being easy to love. You all call this the persona, the mask. The version of you that learned to lead with what you could do rather than what you needed. And here's the part that matters. When your sense of worth gets built around performance, love that has nothing to do with your performance stops making sense. It doesn't length, because nothing in you accounts for it. Nothing explains why you deserve it today when you haven't done anything yet. Think of it like a jet that doesn't exist. Someone hands you something freely and you immediately start working out how to pay them back. Because somewhere early, the lesson was, nothing comes free. Not really. And that lesson never got questioned. It just went quiet. So here's how this actually gets built. Children ain't complicated. What they need is simple, to be loved for existing, to be in a room and have that be enough. But some kids grew up in homes where the love was conditional in a way nobody ever say out loud. And I want to be clear, this doesn't have to look like anything dramatic. It doesn't require a bad parent. Sometimes it's just want that was a little warmer when you did well, a house that felt easier when you were helpful, an atmosphere where need was, even subtly, an inconvenience. So maybe you got more affection when you did well in school. Maybe you figure out young that showing you were struggling make things harder, not easier, so you stop showing it. Or maybe nobody said any of this directly. You just felt it. Kids are incredibly good at feeling things nobody says. And look at what that does over time. The child doesn't just learn to perform. They start to believe the performance is who they are, that the version of them who has something to offer is the real one, and the version who just needs, who is tired or scared or wants to be held without having done anything to earn it, that version start to feels like a secret, like something to hide. You all would say that version gets pushed into the shadow, not because it's bad, because it wasn't safe. So the child grows up. They get very good at taking care of people, often genuinely good at it, the one their friends hold in a crisis, the one who shows up. And this isn't fake anymore, or not entirely, it's real. It's also a kind of insurance, a way of making sure there's always a reason to keep them around. Then someone comes along and loves them without a reason, just likes them, finds them funny or interesting or worth staying up late with. And instead of that feeling like relief, it feels wrong somehow. Because if love doesn't require anything from you, what happens when you stop performing? What happens when they find out the version underneath, the one that needs things, the one that doesn't have it together, is actually there? That's what Ian is pointing out. Not the fear of being unloved, the fear of being fully seen and loved anyway. Because that would mean that that was never real. And that honestly, it's almost harder to stick with than the debt itself. Be honest with yourself for a moment. When someone compliments you, not your work, not something you did, just you, what do you do with it? Do you deflect it? Make a joke? Find some reason it doesn't quite count? When someone offers to help you, Does it feel uncomfortable, like you're somehow a burden for needing it? When the relationship is going well and someone is just constantly there, no drama, no distant, do you find yourself waiting for something to go wrong, feeling a little suspicious of how okay everything is? That's not you being realistic. That's not modesty. That's the part of you that never learned it was allowed to just receive. And here's the thing that makes this so hard to see. These patrons are usually the most generous people in the room. They give a lot, they show up, they make people feel genuinely seen, and they are completely convinced themselves that this is just who they are. A giver, that's their identity. But sometimes being a giver is also a way of staying in control, of making sure you're always the one offering, not the one exposed. So when you owe nothing because you're already paid, I'm not saying the love isn't real. It is real. I'm saying the structure around it might be a defense you built so long ago you've completely forgotten. It's a defense. Yvonne had a name for what happens when someone leaves from the mask for so long they lose track of the person underneath. He caught it leaving from the persona, and it is exhausting. Not dramatically exhausting, quietly exhausting. The kind of tired that leaves in the gap between how much you give and how little you ever let back in. So what actually changes this? The obvious answer is find someone safe, someone patient, someone who will keep showing up until you learn to receive. And I understand why that feels right. But here's the problem. If the belief underneath is that you have to earn the right to be loved, a patient partner doesn't fit as that you just moved the performance. You find new ways to be useful, new reason to justify staying, new depths to quietly run up and pay off. The structure stays exactly where it is, just with a different person inside it. What actually changes? It is what Yvonne called bringing the shadow into consciousness, bringing the bad version of yourself back out. The needing one, the wanting one, the one that doesn't always have it together. Not to perform that either. Not to make your wounds everyone else's problem, but to stop treating your own needs like a secret you have to keep to stop people from leaving. This is hard. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Because in practice, it looks like letting someone seize you on a day where you haven't done anything to deserve their attention, sitting with a compliment without immediately redirecting it, asking for someone without running through a justification in your head first, be with someone's care without starting to calculate how to repay before they've even finished offering. Small things, but if you've spent years tying your worth to what you produce, they will not feel small. What shifts slowly, and not in a straight line, is that you start to feel worth something on the days you haven't earned it. That's what Jung meant by individuation. Not becoming a better version of yourself, becoming a whole one. The debt that doesn't exist starts to dissolve. Not all at once, but enough. And being loved without a reason, which used to feel like a threat, starts to feel like something else. Starts to feel, maybe for the first time, like it was always supposed to feel. Like enough. You were not broken when you learned to earn love. You will keep reading a room, finding the strategy that keep the warmth on. That is not a flaw. That is a child doing the only thing a child can do in a home that taught them love has conditions. Figuring out what the conditions are and meeting them. The problem isn't what you learn. The problem is you never got the chance to question it. Life moved, the strategy worked well enough, and nobody ever stopped to ask what it was costing. Maybe not even you. What it was costing was the simplest thing. The version of you that gets to exist without justifying its presence. That version is still there. It did not go away. It just got very good at being quiet. And most people never go looking for it. Never stop to ask why receiving love feels more dangerous than losing it. Never think to question whether the debt they've been paying is one anybody actually asked for. You're asking, and that matters more than you probably realize right now. The performance got you here. It does not have to kill the rest of the way. When did you first notice that receiving love was harder than giving it? Not just harder, actually uncomfortable. But you didn't know what to do with it. Tell me in the comments. You might say something that you haven't said out loud yet. Next week, we are talking about why some people shut down emotionally the moment a relationship starts to feel real. Not because they don't care, because they care so much it becomes its own kind of danger. Yours concept of the feeling function. What happens when it goes underground? If this one set with you, subscribe. We go deeper every week.